the Honorable Member of Parliament, the Vice Rectors in this room, all the academic leaders and distinguished participants. It's a pleasure for me to visit your dear country for the very first time and to be part of the launching of this global education initiative, which I think it's quite timely, as already outlined. I travel quite a bit, but not as much in Eastern Europe as I should. So this is something that is a bit of a redemption for me. So I'm very grateful. As you all know, we just came from one of those forums on global education, and one of those moments that define the process of global education. So I thought, as we discussed back and forth on how to frame the topic of my exchange with you, was to look at the post-2015 education agenda, the global education agenda, and say what are the challenges and prospects ahead of us. If we can move. But I want to start first with the role of education in development. This is the first slide. You might want to put it on the slideshow mode. Okay. And just to remind ourselves that one of the key reasons we focus so much on education is that it's the bloodline of development, particularly development in the 21st century, which is knowledge and technology driven. But it's also the bloodline of development at different levels of development. At the individual level, education helps us to develop. But also at the meso level of families and households, I think we would clearly say that households and families that are experiencing development invariably are those that have people who have had the chance for good quality education among themselves. And then households, families that are not enjoying the same qualities of development in both contribution and benefiting, invariably are the ones that have been excluded by our education systems. Education is also invaluable and indispensable to propel national development as well as global development. But what do we mean by development? Development is very contextual, because my development, if I were to tell you I'm on a good development track, referring to myself, may be very different from your track. But development is a sense of progress. And development is a state of being, so we will always be striving for it. But at the same time, there are certain blocks of constitute development that we could all, as much as we have different contexts, we could all agree that Lithuania is rapidly developing, or country Y and country Z, even though the nitty-gritties and the details of what constitutes development and what constitutes fulfillment, it's very different. But development is also becoming a very complicated term. I think when we were students, I won't say when, because then everybody will start to know just how old I am. Development was almost invariably seen from an economic and material point of view. But the concept is becoming more sophisticated thanks to the humanistic-oriented scholars like Amartya Sen and others who have focused on development from a humanistic point of view. So it necessarily, also as she was talking about, the Vice Rector was highlighting the constants of change in the 21st century. We've had other elements that signify development more prominently than a couple of decades ago, such as the environment. A couple of decades ago, we actually developed economically and paid no attention to the environment. But now we cannot talk of development without including environmental sustainability. And then the social aspect, the political, cultural, ethical values, and most importantly, many more humanistic or the soft side of development. But development in the 21st century also obliges certain principles. And one of the principles that is becoming a global imperative is the principles of equity and inclusion. I think countries have been developing all along, but I think you would agree with me that the 21st century could easily be dubbed as the century of inclusion, at least in terms of forcing the issue and debating it. But where we came from, we came at some point where it was almost acceptable that some people will live well and others won't. And that's just the way things are. But equity and inclusion are becoming a hallmark of development. If a country is developing, then it should be more equitable. If a person, an individual, is developing, then that person should have a multicultural, multi-religious perspective, multilingual perspective, and the person should actually accept diversity and respect it, and see diversity as something that is inherently good, and not that something that is diverse is necessarily inferior. But at the same time, we came from those times where certain countries, particularly the so-called developed countries, the colonial masters, try to instill in others that a sign of being developed or a sign of developing is actually negating your own identity. When Africans were taught that their languages were inferior languages and your sign of being developed is they should speak European languages, or when certain cultural dresses were seen as something that is backwards and your sign of development is that you should dress unlike yourself. So this negation of the self is becoming a sign of development as we speak about development in the 21st century. There's also respect for rights, that it is no longer okay for countries to call themselves fast developing when they are violating human rights. And when that country, rich as it may be in material terms, but it violates human rights, we categorize it as backward. And we categorize it as a country that is not developing. So these are some of the issues of justice, issues of sustainability, and most importantly, what to me is still a challenge is the global balance of power and the threat to global peace, because the balance of power is still so skewed globally that some countries are more equal than others. Whether we want to say it or not, it plays itself in global politics all the time and in global education. And this inequality cannot be a sign of development for these countries. Actually, a sign of development would be humility. If these countries were behaving in a humble way, they would come through and come across as a bit more developed, or at least more development astute. It is important also that development as we understand it now recognizes the global interconnectedness of humanity and that we share responsibility. But at the same time, we also share benefits and burdens. So whatever you do to advance humanity is shared by the world, but whatever you do also to set humanity backwards is shared by the world. So you can no longer say, oh, in Lithuania, we are growing very rapidly, we are okay, when your next door neighbor is having conflict, if that conflict will affect you. So the interconnectedness of development and the sharing of responsibilities and benefits is important. But the reality now, and part of our challenge, and part of the challenges that global education should address, is the reality that we often, in the 21st century, share burdens but not benefits. And the countries that so-called developed or that pushed their development at a certain pace may in the process create burdens for other countries that do not equitably or commensurately share in the benefits, such as environmental degradation. Because you are doing certain things to advance yourself, that advancement may impact others negatively, and therefore your development is a handicap to others. So part of what we should be looking at in global education is how do we inculcate this broader conceptualization of development with its principles and with the recognition of the interconnectedness. Education is not just good, it's not just a public good because it facilitates development. Education is a right. Everybody has the right to education. And you could ask why. To my mind, because everybody has the right to develop. And to the extent that education facilitates your development, it stands to reason that education, therefore, should be an unalienable human right. Everybody also has the right to contribute. And actually, anybody who finds themselves in a position where they benefit, but they are not able to contribute, that benefit tends to take your self-esteem down. We all like to contribute. We all like to progress and to benefit, but at the same time, we enjoy contributing. And that is why anybody who finds themselves collecting food coupons or on social welfare, who benefits from the contribution of others, but they are not able to optimally contribute, does not enjoy that benefit. Ironic as it may be, since we are supposedly hedonist, we also like to struggle in order to enjoy the struggle, isn't it? And we have the right to exercise our rights. And education is one of the instruments that enable us to understand our rights and to exercise our rights and to hold accountable those who threaten our rights and to extract accountability out of them if they so choose not to volunteer accountability, particularly people in leadership. So education is important from a rights perspective. So it is a global good, and I will try to go because we have to move. So basically, what I want to emphasize is that education that supports holistic development, as painted, necessarily supports and depends on responsible and beneficiating global citizens. So you cannot have development without responsible and beneficiating global citizens. So global citizenship is a cornerstone of development as we understand it now. And therefore, global education that grooms global citizens is of particular importance. And I don't think I need to lecture you on what global citizenship is. You are already launching that. But just to flag that the fact that we have the concept of citizenship goes beyond national boundaries is a benefit, but it's also a huge responsibility again, because you are no longer just a citizen of Lithuania, you are a citizen of the world, and your contribution now runs across many boundaries, some of which you don't even know. But just understanding that your contributions go beyond your boundaries is quite important. So I just want to highlight that point. I then want to go and say, because education is so important for development, for human rights, there is a lot of global effort to build what we call a global education agenda, and therefore out of those agendas we get global education. I just want to highlight some of the direct global instruments for setting the education agenda globally. And we have some milestones that are well known for those who are in education. We always had a global education agenda setting. This morning I was chatting with your academic leaders here and the Honorable Member of Parliament, and highlighting to them that since about the early 1920s, the IBE, the institution that I ran, had been the intergovernmental education body that helps ministers of education to come together and set an agenda for education. But this process has been enriching itself over time, and it has become institutionalized, and it has a general planning cycle, almost like national development planning. I'm sure in this country, I don't know whether you use the medium-term expenditure frameworks or you use national development plans or whatever, but there is a cycle to which Lithuania works to and plans according to. We also now have a cycle according which the world plans. So we have global instruments that help us to set agendas. And we have convening power of certain institutions to bring the world together under one roof and to determine the global agenda in education. I just want to remind you of the 1990, I think, was the hallmark in terms of really having an aggressive global agenda on education that says it is no longer okay for education to be selective and exclusive and inequitable, and therefore we need education for all. We still need to say education by all, but for now it is education for all. And the for all, while it is good, anything that is for you can be done by others or by yourselves, but education for all by all is what we ought to be striving towards, because the by all recognizes the multiplicity of knowledges, and that education does not come from one, it's not a unidirectional flow, but is a contribution from all angles, as we said. We had a midterm review in Amman, and then a setting of a more aggressive agenda in Dakar in 2000 that came up with the formally what is often referred to as the Education for All framework, with its 6 goals that I'm sure are well known to you. And just last week we came back from Incheon in Korea to set the agenda until 2030. Now, this signifies the importance we are attaching to education as a sorority, as a globe, and the instruments that we are able to use. I am going to skip very fast through all those tables. For those who are interested, I have summarized the highlights of each of these major points in the setting of the global agenda for education and the strategies that were followed. The second set of direct instruments, so one direct instrument is the global dialogue and global agenda setting, which we are now doing in a cycle that is every so many years, we will come together and set the agenda. And then out of this, we will also come together and set sector-specific agendas. That is the agenda for TVET, the agenda for higher education, and so on. So this is the first set of direct instruments. The second set of direct instruments are what we call them conventions and recommendations. And these conventions and recommendations, they are UN conventions, and in education, they are UNESCO-specific conventions and recommendations. And these give the legal, the conventions, and the moral, the recommendations, force, such that if citizens, if the global citizens actually understood the legal bite of these conventions, they actually can sue the state for violating their right to education. It's only one country that I know that kids took the king to court for failing to provide education for all in accordance with the convention. But I haven't heard of any country where citizens exercise their right to education and to good quality and development relevant education, enough to say to their members of parliament, excuse me, sir, you are violating my right. I put you there as my executive to execute on my behalf. You are my superior messenger, but at the end of it, you are a messenger. And when I send you to do something as a citizen by voting for you, I expect you to run the errand and actually report back to me. I've put some of the most important conventions that relate to education and the articles that specifically refer to education that are direct instruments for building a global education. I won't go through them individually. This could be a matter of individual read. But I want to highlight the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education to say that to date, 196 countries have signed this convention. So since these conventions have legal bite, you would imagine that by now we shouldn't have countries where there is such violation of the right to education by excluding some people, by giving others poor quality education, by giving others education that is divorced to their real needs. So what the challenge here is that actually signing an instrument does not mean giving an instrument effect. And monitoring the instrument, the implementation of the instrument as we do as UNESCO is not enough if the citizens, the global citizens, are first of all not aware of the instrument, secondly not aware of its implications for them, and thirdly not aware of the power they actually have, as I said at the beginning, to extract accountability from those who ought to be offering accountability. But all the same, if we were playing a numbers game, we are doing pretty good. But beyond the numbers is a serious challenge. And these are the challenges post-2015. How can we take these instruments and give them real legal bite? It's only the teachers who often call their member states to task, because teachers are empowered, they are adults, and they know their rights because they are educated, and they often use the Convention on the Rights of the Teaching Profession. Actually, it's the one cadre that uses the Convention more than any other that I am aware of. But still, we have all these that are legal instruments, like 136 countries have safeguards to the right to education inscribed in the Constitution. But how many citizens have ever read their constitutions or even know it, just know that it exists, or even understand the term constitution and what implications a constitution has for them? How many? A lot. In Lithuania, this is very impressive. And they exercise the right. We have an increasing number of countries, but we are beginning to see at least the legal instruments are beginning to give effect to this. And we are seeing also the span of the number of years that constitutes basic education or compulsory education increasing and approaching senior secondary education as a result of this. So we are moving along. There's a lot to celebrate, but there is a lot of more to work on. The next slides, can you go next one? Show what of these instruments. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I want to summarize all these slides, and there are many of them, with just one statement: that as a result of these direct instruments for setting the agenda for global education, phenomenal progress has been recorded in expanding access to education, particularly at the lower level, particularly at the primary level and the lower secondary level. Higher education is still a challenge, and post-basic education is still a challenge. And basic education is differentially defined from 9 years sometimes to 12 years. But there are a few very poor countries that still just stop at primary education as basic education. All these slides are summarized in one sentence, that sentence. This is all about progress in expanding access to education. So these instruments, the direct instruments, are having effect. The third instrument are what I call the indirect instrument, and these are through the international development agencies, you can call them, that once the global policy for education is set, they then push these global policies to be implemented, sometimes with conditionalities, such as my former institution, the World Bank, will drive the implementation of globally agreed goals. But it's not only the World Bank. UNESCO would promote this, the UNDP, I just put a few examples, UNICEF and so on. So this cluster of globally driven institutions, whether they are multilateral or bilateral, are another instrument for giving effect to global education in operationalizing the policies that are adopted at the global level. So if we look also at individual personalities of global impact, such as presidents of countries, such as the UN Secretary General, these individuals also tend to give effect to global education. And I just chose one because your initiative is about global citizenship. I just chose one by the Secretary General of the UN Education First that articulate the necessity to promote global citizenship. And therefore, these highly placed personalities can shape global education one way or another. Another example is Gordon Brown and his efforts. And these highly placed personalities sometimes, not always, also act as special envoys or goodwill ambassadors for a specific cause in education. And they are another instrument that drives global education forward. So we may want to look at these. We also have some, from the global citizenship education, because you are focusing on this, I chose to highlight some of the barriers that stand in the way of developing global citizenship education. And one of them is lack of leadership. Because it's easy to talk about global citizenship in these halls, but it's yet another to act it. It's another when a shipload of refugees is bouncing up and down in the high seas, because we are still debating whether or not we can open our doors to them. It's another when I get very inty and repelled because I'm sitting next to somebody of a different color of skin. It's another when I tell my child, you will not go out with this boy because he's homosexual. He'll teach you something that I don't want you to know. It's another, and it's another, and it's another. And the leadership for global citizenship does not rest only with the political leaders or academic leaders like in this room. It rests actually with each and every individual. And this is where the trick is. Because if each one of us speaks of global citizenship as a matter of theory, but we don't live it, then the concept will take very long to take root. And we will have all these phobias for all sorts of reasons. But it's also inadequacy on the focus on values. And values are very tricky. I don't mean to be politically insensitive, but culture can be very tricky. Because while we talk about multiculturalism and celebrating cultures, interreligiousness, there are times when culture becomes a violator of some values. When you stand up and say, in my culture, it is okay for a woman to have a lower status than a man, and you defend it from a cultural point of view. Or in my culture, it is okay for somebody to be demanded to behave in this particular way because they come from a linguistic minority and so on and so forth. So the focus on values has to be acting the values rather than just listing them on papers that we often do. And then the capacity to teach. And here it's not just the teachers and the teaching profession, but everybody who has the capacity to share knowledge and other issues like the curriculum and the legacy of our education systems, because sometimes, most times actually, the weaknesses of our education system reflects the weaknesses of our own societies. Education systems often mirror the societies. And while we expect education systems to pull the society forward, education systems also depend on societies to be pushed forward. So that relationship makes it sometimes very difficult to exercise global citizenship and global education. I just wanted to share with you some of the efforts that UNESCO is doing to push, operationalize global citizenship and global education, and to support member states to actually implement global citizenship education. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on the slides. I just want to say UNESCO is one of the entities that try to operationalize global citizenship education, basically because most member states are still debating, how do we handle this? Is it a subject? Do we integrate it into our curricula across subjects? How do we integrate them? What would be the host subjects? What would be the host concepts? There are still a lot of issues out there that we are still working through in global citizenship and in global education. But moving now forward, we just came out of the agenda setting for up to 2030, carrying some baggage from the EFA, what is often referred to as the EFA unfinished business, but looking forward with lessons from the EFA unfinished business. For those of you that I'm sure you are already very familiar with the framework for the SDGs, but Goal 4 of the new SDGs speaks to ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. You would see that the lesson that we carried over from the EFA 6 goals was that we had a set of 6 goals that we call the EFA framework of action and collaboration. And in implementing this framework, we implemented the 6 goals unevenly, so some of them made progress, some of them less progress. And Goal 2, which spoke to primary education, universal access to primary education, was reinforced by the MDGs that spoke about completion of primary education. And therefore, progress, as I said, was exponential with access to primary education. But other goals we did not do as well as we had set for the targets. One of them was reducing illiteracy by half. Another one was expanding access to early childhood care and education, which is an indispensable foundation for quality education and an indispensable foundation for equity and inclusion, because people like yourselves who are in higher education are often accused for being snobbish and for being exclusive. But the reality is that higher education institutions cannot reconfigure students' background by the time the students arrive. The reconfiguration was done at the lower levels, and higher education institutions can only work with the pipeline that they receive. So if our education system acts like sieves, and you pour the kids into the sieve, and you let children of the poor and the disadvantaged drop out of the holes of the sieve, and you catch only the privileged, then our higher education institutions will be privileged, and it will be just children of the rich who will be in higher education. So as we talk about global education, if you want to make impact and hold up one of the fundamental principles of global education, which is equity and inclusion, higher education institutions cannot bury their heads in the sand like ostriches and say that, oh, we are just professors at the university. They have to get down to the trenches and deal with inequalities in education at the lowest levels, starting with early childhood care and education and going up. So higher education cannot be blamed, but it is to blame because the torchbearers intellectually are in higher education institutions, the best thinkers. You are the brain trust. And if you do not solve a problem, then who would? So it is very important when we launch this global education initiative and look at the principles of global education as we try to summarize them and ask yourself, what role do we play as higher education institutions, and refuse the temptation of lecturing about global education in your lecture halls, but go down and make global education a living phenomena in Lithuania and in the world. Since by launching this, you are claiming your ground, you are staking your ground that you are global citizens and you are going to be contributing. These are some of the challenges that you must address. But looking at the rest of the goals, the issue with education is, yes, it is goal 4, but at the same time, it is an enabler of all other goals. So if something goes wrong with goal 4, everything will go wrong with all the other goals. That is the power of education, and that's the power of global education. It can either be poison in the veins of a country or of a globe, or it can be a medicine that we need. So again, as we talk about the global education initiative, we necessarily have to look beyond the education sector. We therefore have to ask the question, what for? Why this education? What the hell for? Why are we making such a hype about global education? And if we cannot ask and answer the question, what for, then our education system, the global education system that you are trying to put in place, will fail. Because the beauty of an ecological system is that if any part goes awry, the rest will go awry. Education is an enabler for all these other goals, but education depends on these other goals for it to function as well. We cannot have poverty and global education, I can assure you, because the poor will be out. So we have to address issues of poverty. We cannot have phobia, we cannot have unclean water. All these goals support education, but they in turn depend on education. So I just want to, for you to reflect on this, that as you talk about your global education initiative, how symbiotic and how much is it well connected into the ecosystem that education ought to be with other subsectors. Otherwise, it will fail. It will be very nice in the lecture halls. Because one thing we are good at academics is that we can talk, as you can see, and we can write. But whether what we talk and write can walk the talk is another issue. This goal is a lesson from the EFA 6 goals, because one of the lessons from the EFA was that we framed the goals as if all countries were at the same level and could march to the same drum beat. For instance, if you said universal primary education by X, and you are talking to a country that had 98% access, and on the other hand, another country has 15% access, to put a target that is the same could be quite a struggle for the ones that have a deeper floor. The ceiling is very high because we have to consider that when you talk about targets, the height of the ceiling is determined by the depth of the floor. And if the floor is too deep, then the ceiling is unreachable to some extent. But by framing that, you are also making the 98% country complacent. I've already arrived. I've achieved the global goal. So when we talk about our global education initiative, we need to pay attention that it has a pull-up effect on everybody. It has a pull-up effect on those who are in a very deep floor, but it has a pull-up effect on those who are almost at the ceiling. And framing a goal like this when you talk about inclusion, because you will never be inclusive, you will always try to be inclusive, and it's a state of being. Framing about equity, about quality, about lifelong learning, these are perennials, because we will never say we have learned. So we will always be learning. So if a country was already somewhere there relative to another, it still has the stars to reach for. So the framing of the EFA goals brought down the stars for some of the countries and opened the heavens to go into space and beyond for other countries. So by framing this agenda in this manner, it allows the countries to find their own targets, to see how high the ceiling is, and to benchmark themselves against themselves over time in a regular way. The question is when, in an attainable way, when we frame our global education initiative, how realistic is it? And how realistic is it, but at the same time, not leveling everybody to a lowest common denominator, or put in targets that are unattainable, so that Lithuania can move along with this global education initiative wherever the point is. Because this country, like any other country, is not an even floor. It has undulations. But is our global education initiative going to take into account these undulations? But at the same time, do we have the bare minimum below which nobody should fall? Because if we leave it like, oh, it's undulations, the trap of that is that you could easily accept inequality and say that, oh, they started from different levels. Okay, so if this group just went just to the first floor, but it came from 8 floors down, it has phenomenally improved, yes, but is that first floor enough for Lithuania? So we have to necessarily have thresholds and define thresholds below which nobody should fall, because if we define those thresholds below which nobody should fall, it means we have to necessarily put more effort on those who are in the deeper floor than those who are in the upper floor. But as humanity is, without demotivating those who are in the upper floors, because we're actually counting on them to help pull up the others. So these are some of the issues that we need to look at. Another lesson from the EFA agenda was that some of these are moving targets. So when you talk about literacy, now we know in the 21st century, we talk about literacies. There isn't a point where you are literate. I'm literate, but I'm illiterate in many things. You are literate, but you are also illiterate in many things. So when we talk about these goals, what this goal allows us to be contextual and to be able to define what exists for who and where. The rest of these are just the building blocks of the goal. I don't need to go into the details. We have to, I've already started talking about the lessons. One other lesson is partnerships from the EFA agenda, which is a global education agenda. So when you launch your agenda, when you are launching your global education initiative, who are your strategic partners? And why are these strategic? And whom should we have around what table and when? This is really important because you are in a different situation in a way, but a good part of being a global player, like you want to be, is that sometimes you have to straddle a long span of contexts. Because a well-educated global citizen is one who is able to go to their dusty little rural village and fit like an old shoe, but they can also be in any country in the topmost part of that country and still fit like an old shoe. The challenge isn't for you, luckily, because you are already high up there. The challenge is for children of the developing world who has to function in a certain environment, but also function in other environments where the distance between them is enormous. So we have to ask the question, is this global education, the global education that is of good worth, is one that opens the context, but at the same time does not alienate you from the context. There was, and there is still, some debates that make my body crawl when I hear, oh, we must do some programs so that people do not migrate from rural villages. They can find something to do in the rural villages because urban migration is coming. Who are you going to tell not to go to the urban areas? And on what grounds? The issue isn't that people should not migrate from a rural area, which is ejecting them because of hardships, to the urban areas, but that we should make the rural life as attractive as whatever is attracting people to the urban life, and then let people choose based on their preferences, and not because you are asking people to choose disadvantage. Can you imagine how ludicrous this is? We know very well why people leave rural areas, and then we say that we will give them some incentives to choose disadvantage. So we have to ask, how is this global education initiative, how is it going to play in the different contexts of Lithuania? And how is it going to play then to geopolitically and strategically position Lithuania in the globe, so that we are playing in the Super League, and the Super League has very different levels depending on the context that we are looking at. And it's not just the geographical context, it's also the temporal context. Because the global education of Lithuania today, which is good, may not be good for Lithuania 5 years from now, 10 years from now. The question is, how are we going to ensure currency of this global education, to keep current with Lithuania and to keep current with the world? These are some of the challenges that we have, not only in Lithuania, but anybody who is trying to work in global education and is trying to tackle these issues like global citizenship. And then the issues of resourcing, financial resources, but most importantly, the technical and intellectual resources. If we are serious about global education, we have to be able to harvest all knowledges of Lithuanians first, be they the schooled ones, the people we call educated, or those who are not schooled, but are knowledgeable, because if we don't accept the diversity of knowledge systems and different forms of knowing, what we may be positioning is not actually global education, it may be education of a certain knowledge conviction, a certain knowledge paradigm, to the exclusion of those which are outside the paradigm. But we have to ask the question, what knowledge is worth it? I know it's politically ugly, but we do have to ask the question, because the spread of knowledge is so enormous and overwhelming. We need to ask then, what knowledge is worth it? But in order to define the worth, we have to ask the why. Why is this knowledge, the development relevance that I started off with, why is this knowledge important and therefore it needs to be included? So lots of questions that we need to look at when we are talking about this, and these lessons emerging out of the previous global education agendas. We need to look at the monitoring of the progress. Have we determined what success looks like? In our global education initiative, what will give us fulfillment that, yeah, we are on the road home, we are going where we were trying to go? What would this success look like? How do we monitor it? And how do we, each time we monitor, set our success markers higher? And how do we balance the quantitative and the qualitative markers of success? The quantitative are easy, but it's the qualitative markers of success on something that is already nebulous, like global education, that we need to camp a little bit and try to focus on. The rest of these are some of the challenges that remain. I'm not going to spend time on them. Again, I'll summarize them with one sentence. The story is we've made huge progress in global education, but a lot of people are still excluded. And therefore, we are not home dry in terms of access, even though the success has been quite important. So I'm gonna you can look at this when you are easy. I've heard this word many times, relaxed. The biggest challenge by far is that of equity of education quality, because the reality is that there is no country, no matter how small or how poor, that does not know how to give Rolls-Royce quality education. Anywhere you go, you will find the best, and just schools and learning environments that just make you go, wow. That's not the challenge. So the quality education is not mysterious. We know the technology of doing it. What is the challenge is we give quality education to too few in any country you go to. The challenge is to give quality education equitably. The second challenge is to have that development relevance, accepting that development has elements that are common that we can all agree on, but it also has contextual specificities to the individual and to collectives. And balancing commonality to specificity is not very easy. But if we want to go global education, we have to find those pulse points where we agree. Those are easy. The most difficult part is where we don't agree, like what are good values? It's very easy to talk about values education, multiculturalism, and so on, and, accept all cultures and celebrate all cultures. But do we accept a culture that tells us that something that smacks on the face of values that we hold dear? And when we get into these very sticky situations, instead of addressing them, we cow out and we keep quiet. But is it okay for me to tell you that I have freedom of speech? Let me say, I have the right to enjoy my music, if I so like music. But if I have neighbors, my right may deafen them, and they have the right to hear and have good eardrums. Where do we draw the line between rights, my individual rights, or collective rights of countries, and the rights of others? If we go back to that interconnectedness of a global citizen to me, and this is truly personal to me, is somebody who has enough restraint even to deny themselves what they believe in, if that inconveniences or violates others. But if I insist this is my right, even if you tell me this right of yours when you exercise it, it really violates me, then we have a problem. So global education is not without boundaries, and rights are not without boundaries, but the conversation is very political. And the conversation often goes to the balance of power, and those who have power tend to believe that their rights are sacred and they may not be touched. But there can be a debate and room for maneuver when it comes to the rights of others. Now, global education has to educate, particularly our upcoming generations, about how to exercise rights while respecting other people's rights, even if it means denying yourself something or denying yourself a right. These would be some of the sticky issues and the sticky principles that we have to look at very closely when we design this initiative in Lithuania, so that it really lives to the spirit that I believe it's coming from. Lifelong learning, for as long as you know, the Vice Rector highlighted the 21st century, the constant thing about the 21st century is change. The one thing we are sure of is there will be change, and it is rapid, and it's unexpected sometimes, and it makes us, demands of us to be on our toes and to be lifelong learners. So the lifelong learning is a profound survival tool. It boils down really to that. As a country, if it's not a learning society, a learning country, others will take you for breakfast. As an individual, if you are not a lifelong learner, others will take you for dessert. So basically, the issue is how do we inculcate these issues? I'm not going to go here. I just shared with you some of the key points of the Incheon Declaration that we just came out of. But this Incheon Declaration tries to take the building blocks of that goal 4 and separates it into specific targets, but without saying that each country should reach that target. Again, this is easy reading for when you have time. I just want to say, I want to end up here and ask, what are the lessons for the VMU Global Education Initiative coming from the global education efforts that we have lived and you continue to live? And what is it that we can build on so that our initiative is of a much higher level and a much sophisticated level than the mistakes of the past initiatives, and that each new initiative actually has that pull-up effect even on the ongoing initiatives. How are we going to use this global education initiative to help Lithuania to better implement the Education 2030, but to implement it in an exemplary manner so that we can find some promising practices in this country? And I want to end by thanking you again for listening and for inviting me, and for being gutsy to launch this initiative, and pledge that whenever it makes sense, sometimes it might remotely make sense, we would be happy at IBE to support you in any manner that we can. Thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you very much for such a rich, inspiring, and very motivating speech. We have a few minutes for question session. Before a question is generated, I have...
It was too clear, don't generate questions.
No. There was one matter, one issue, I think, that has touched VMU personally, because as we've mentioned, myself and Vice Rector Globalaus, that VMU is a liberal arts university. And you know what we are struggling with? The atmosphere that is extremely unfriendly to liberal arts, or humanities, or social sciences in general. The general rhetoric that is coming on in the field of higher education is very strong push on hard sciences, on technologies, deprivileging humanities and social sciences. And we are trying to stand up and show that society needs humanities, society needs culture, of course societies need science, and they co-lived for many, many centuries together, so why some parts of sciences need to be deprivileged? But in the concept of, that you beautifully explain how concept of development has changed, it integrated exactly the approach that comes from humanistic side. And there is hope for us. Because even though the general rhetoric, the mainstream rhetoric that is picked up by politicians, that is picked up by mainstream media, is a push on hard sciences, and we have to be much more effective, we have to modernize ourselves. And I think there is hope for humanities and social sciences. There is hope for liberal arts education, which we really strongly have to stand up and sort of show ourselves that we are confident, that we have to. build better societies. So it was not a question, but such a comment that I really felt that it was clear, but I still sort of found this very, very sort of binding link between initiative of global education and things that we are developing and we live every day.
I think one of the considerations, if I were in your shoes, would be the world is evidence crazy, whether or not we like it, but is to demonstrate with evidence the indispensability of humanities. And I don't think you should be impatient with explaining the obvious. We shouldn't have to explain that the world needs humanities and liberal arts, but you should not be impatient with explaining, because human nature is that when there is a problem, by trying to address the problem, we tend to take our eye from the areas that were not problematic. And then we create a new problem. So we like this uneven swaying of attention, and this is problematic. To my mind, science and technology have a scarcity premium, just because for whatever reason, these are areas that have been elusive for education system to produce enough technologists and scientists whom we need. But by focusing on this problem, it does not mean that we should starve the world of the humanists that we need. But if you talk to this way to politicians and to science economists, they're not going to hear you. The best way is to demonstrate how humanities actually adds to development with evidence. Take culture, for instance. Just look at what is the percentage of the GDP that culture contributes to the GDP in countries that develop, commercialize, and package their culture well. Why is it that you will find a McDonald's in every place you can imagine, even where there is nothing, you will find a McDonald's, but you don't find Lithuanian cuisines? Food is cultural, isn't it? Why are we all wearing jeans? Why are we listening to American music? When you get into a store, what do you hear? And if you can take these countries that have developed their cultures very, very well and package them and show Lithuania, see what you can do if you really packaged and developed our culture. Why is it that a tiny little island managed to make its language the language of the world? Here we are speaking English from a tiny little island. And the world speaks this language. Can you imagine the premium and the economic benefits of just English to the motherland of this? Why do you think the Chinese are trying to build so many Confucius centers in many universities for the Chinese language to penetrate? Why don't you see that this is strategic and this is the... So if you can just take a dry, non-humanistic argument and just demonstrate with evidence that actually humanities are extremely important. Even to learning science, you need to have certain social skills and certain humanistic orientation to be a better scientist, but you have to put evidence on the table. You cannot just say it's important, because then you sound like you are whining, or you are defending, or you are trying to preserve your careers or your university and whatnot. So it is your burden to prove your worth, and to prove your worth with evidence. And honestly, the evidence abounds. I don't think you won't be in short supply, you know. And there are countries like, for instance, maybe 2-3 years ago, Brazil, the GDP contribution of culture, just the music, the food. Can you imagine how many of you in your houses have music from these countries? But how many of them have music from you? And whenever you buy this, music, where does the money end up? It goes back to where the music was made. So if you don't show the fine arts, what are we watching with the fine arts? Who wins at the Olympics and what are they doing at the Olympics? Unless you give this evidence, you will sound like, okay, they don't want their useless university to be closed. The unfortunate tragedy is that the worth of the university will be discovered only after closing it, and you go, oh my God. So it is your responsibility to really say that when you have load-bearing pillars of a house, and one pillar is shaking, like STEM education, you don't fix it by breaking the other pillar, because your house falls all over again. So it's this balanced approach to development that we're talking about. But please explain yourself with evidence. But it sounds irritating, but it's the truth.
Thank you. Natalie.
I would like to back once more for this concept of development, which includes social, political, cultural issues, because your presentation sounds in another light, taking into consideration pressures which we experience as a university and other universities. First pressure is that we are participating in horse races, and actually we participate in all possible institutional evaluations in a ranking system, and we are very self-centric. We are centered toward higher education as a sector, and it was important to hear, to listen, to understand the role of other sectors, primary education, basic education, and we ignore these sectors. Since we participate in these horse races, and actually we are centered toward ourselves without seeing other sectors which are important. And also the second pressure is, which as Rector Auxer mentioned, it is pressure which comes from politicians, from employers, from enterprises. That the university has to be servant for economy, and this idea of supply and demand is very important, that we forget other issues, that not only economy is important, other factors, social inclusion and accessibility of all stages of education is important. So that is why this concept and this ideology of service to labor, to employers and to enterprises is sometimes is not the best ideology, which doesn't allow to see other aspects of education, that education is a stimulus in other sense, a sense of social integration.
Yes, please. Elena.
Yes, I would like to appreciate the point of view that you shared with us in terms of probably responsibility and thinking what will be the contribution of this university. I probably share the opinion that we have a lot of people who start initiatives silently, episodically, experimentally in a small scope. And these initiatives usually are related with global education. And maybe the soundboard that we're going to implement the global education is not suitable for one university as such, as you mentioned. But we have a lot of initiatives that are contributions towards it. Yes, the obstacles exist, and sadly enough, we are even sometimes obliged to close programs that are aimed at global education. Because the world does not see teachers, for example, who are teaching online, and we live in Europe, country in Lithuania, so we need to oblige these rules. So when we do something in another matter, in another way, we have to refuse and to detach sometimes from these initiatives. But we have a lot. But in fact, we are also the nation that has a different language. So we cannot be global in terms of our culture, and probably this is our diversity. But a lot of contributions also from UNESCO and other organizations come that, for example, the development of open educational resources in diverse languages is already supported. So this is also very important for us, this collaboration and support for a small nation with diverse culture, diverse language, diverse ideas is also very important. And one more important thing I think that we have to discuss, and maybe your experience is crucial here, is how to measure our plans, our strategy in terms of scalability, so that we manage them. But also in terms of not losing these small initiatives towards some important steps. I think we have a lot already done in terms of lifelong learning, in terms of opening up, but opening up of a university in a small country in a responsible way, in a scalable way, is very challenging. So I think that your insights and maybe your availability of these discussions would be very important.